What's interesting, though, is that God won't listen to reason. Instead, he counters by raising the expectation. He has Abraham go outside and look up at the stars of heaven. We have to picture the night sky with the stars of the Milky Way overhead. God tells him that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars. So here again is a crux in the narrative. On the one hand, Abraham's experience calls for realism about being childless. On the other hand, there's the promise of countless descendants. Being childless calls for resignation. Receiving the promise calls for hope. Which will it be? This is the point where Abraham again believes. And the narrative says that God considers his faith to be righteousness. The term righteousness, or tzedakah in Hebrew, has a relational sense. It shows that trust or faith is the right form of relating to God. In the Christian tradition, this is one of the major themes in the story of Abraham. And New Testament authors like the Apostle Paul will quote this verse in their writings. But as we continue with the narrative in Genesis, we see that for Abraham, living by faith is more challenging than expected. In chapter 16, more time has passed, and now it's Sarah's turn to be impatient. God has raised the expectations, but he still has not given them any children. So Sarah determines to use a surrogate mother. They have a young slave girl in the house, whose name is Hagar. Hagar is from Egypt, and Sarah tells Abraham that he should father a child through her. Well, Abraham seems quite willing to go along with the plan, so he spends the night with the slave girl, and soon Hagar finds that she's pregnant. But instead of improving things, this development only makes them worse. Conflict breaks out when Hagar gloats that she's been able to conceive when Sarah has not. That attitude seems outrageous to Sarah, and she brings up the issue with Abraham. At this point, Abraham's approach seems anything but noble. He's gotten Hagar pregnant, but now he simply shrugs and tells Sarah to do whatever she wants with the servant girl. So Sarah mistreats her and humiliates her until Hagar runs away into the desert. She's pregnant and alone. It's a poignant moment in the story, and it's important to reflect on what we make of it as readers. As I've said, people often expect Abraham and Sarah to be models of virtue, and they may be surprised when they see it's not always the case. In this episode, Sarah seems harsh, and Abraham seems unfeeling, and Hagar pays the price for their actions. Yet this moment of conflict is the setting for divine action. God seeks out Hagar in the desert. He finds this teenage runaway and stops to listen. God asks her a question, which is something no one else has done. He asks her where she's coming from and where she's going, and Hagar says she's a runaway. After listening to her story, God makes her a promise. He says that Hagar, too, despite all that has occurred, will be blessed, and the child she's carrying will be a reminder of God's concern for the runaway. The child will be called Ishmael, a name that means God listens. And through Ishmael, Hagar will be blessed with many descendants. And having received that promise, Hagar returns to Abraham and Sarah and gives birth to her son, Ishmael. Now, as you read a story like this one, be sure to reflect on characterization. You can see that Abraham exhibits both trust and indifference. He's both admirable and flawed. And Sarah is complex too. Earlier, she was put at risk because of Abraham's scheme back in Egypt. Now she puts Hagar at risk through her own schemes and jealousy. It's within this context of flawed human action that God plays the positive role. It's God's compassion towards the runaway that carries the narrative forward. And it's divine action that opens up a more promising future. As we come to chapters 17 and 18, we find God's character more fully disclosed through laughter. Here the narrative takes up the problem of Abraham and Sarah's childlessness. At the beginning of chapter 17, we're told that Abraham is now 99 years old. That means 24 years have passed since Abraham first received the promise. He's been waiting for a child for almost a quarter century. So it seems ludicrous for God to keep repeating a promise that he has not fulfilled. Yet that's what happens for more than half a chapter. God again tells Abraham that he will be the father of many nations. He will be the ancestor of kings who are yet to come. God describes a glorious future in which all these descendants have a home in the land of Canaan. And now he refers to this as his covenant with Abraham. The Hebrew word for a covenant is berit. A berit is a binding commitment. It commits God to maintaining a relationship with Abraham's descendants. It creates a bond between God and these people. As a sign of this covenant relationship, God says that all of Abraham's male descendants should be circumcised. Both slaves and the sons of free people must be circumcised if they want to belong to this people. Throughout the generations that follow, circumcision remains a key marker of Jewish identity. And in the New Testament, it becomes a point of debate among the followers of Jesus. As Christian communities came to include both Jewish and non-Jewish members, they debated whether circumcision would still be the sign of the covenant for them. They eventually decided that it would not, but in Genesis, circumcision does play a defining role. And after emphasizing circumcision, God repeats that Sarah will be the mother of many nations and kings. Well, at this point, Abraham simply laughs because the whole thing seems absurd. He laughs and points out that he's nearly 100 years old. He points out that Sarah is almost 90. The very idea of childbearing is ludicrous, and laughter is the best response. Abraham says he's quite content now that Hagar has given birth to Ishmael, and God should let well enough alone. So in the face of the laughter, God says he will finally take action. He tells Abraham that in just one more year, Sarah will give birth. The pattern is repeated in chapter 18, where Sarah assumes a larger role. Here, Abraham is seated at the door of his tent as three strangers approach. Abraham hurries out to meet them and invites them to stay for a meal. Some water is brought so they can wash up and rest. Then Abraham rushes to the tent and has Sarah start making some bread. Abraham slaughters a calf to serve as the main course. And when the meal is ready, the three strangers eat. As they do so, Sarah remains out of sight. She's hidden in the tent, listening to the conversation. The strangers repeat that Sarah will have a son. And now it's Sarah's turn to laugh. The narrator tells us that her menstrual cycle ended years ago. And Sarah tells herself that she and Abraham are so old that she can't even imagine having sexual relations with him, much less a child. The narrative puts it politely as the two of them having pleasure. But the visitors overhear her laughter and say that in due time she will bear a son. Well, finally the promise comes true in chapter 21 when a son is born to Abraham and Sarah. And the theme of this section is apparent in his name, which is Isaac. In Hebrew, Isaac means he laughs. The point is that Abraham laughed, then Sarah laughed, and now God gets the last laugh. At Isaac's birth, Sarah says,